Every painter is unique. Their art style, subject matter, and composition set them apart from others in some way. But some take this freedom to a different level, and when we say painter or an artist, they become one of the first names that comes to everyone's mind. Vincent van Gogh is one of the first names that comes to mind, and he is such a master at his craft that even someone furthest from art, even someone who says, "Art does not interest me, it does not appeal to me," can be affected by his works. And the strangest part of all is that Van Gogh was 27 when he decided to become a painter. Even worse, his career, which began at a relatively late age, ended with his death at 37. In this short artistic career of 10 years, he accomplished things that stun the public to this day. Although most people know him for his struggle with mental illness, cutting off his ear, and his controversial suicide, Van Gogh's real story is not so much his personal life, but the art he practiced. He first tried his luck in different professions, and later attempted to be an art dealer, but things did not go as expected. He could not hold down any menial jobs. At last, he decided to become a painter, and his biggest supporter in this process was his brother Theo van Gogh. Theo discussed art with his brother, commented on it, and gave him advice. The two corresponded for a long time through letters, and in one of them Van Gogh shared about his first major work. He had sketched an old outline of the work and said that he believed there was life in it. The Potato Eaters was Van Gogh's first major work. This peasant family, exhausted from a day of hard labor, is enjoying a well-deserved meal of potatoes. The fact that they're eating potatoes is significant, because life is hard for a peasant, especially a truly impoverished one. Access to meat is difficult, and even bread is hard to come by, but potatoes are always accessible. These peasants probably planted these potatoes themselves, and while not a very elaborate meal, it's a well-deserved, honestly earned food. The clock on the wall, the religious painting, and the oil lamp hanging from the ceiling all provide the impression of a typical village home. The faces of the figures are also noteworthy. Their rough, bony features fit the image of a peasant we have in our minds. Van Gogh had a particular fondness for peasants and working people, and this fondness inspired many of his paintings. Van Gogh did not only depict rural life in this work, but his series of studies of rural characters brought rural life back to the forefront. He was particularly influenced by Jean-François Millet's paintings depicting rural life in France. They are captivating, and they draw the viewer in. These paintings highlight the noble side of the peasant's struggle for life. Van Gogh was very impressed by this attitude towards the peasants in the paintings, and wanted to similarly depict village life himself. He also likened his own artistic journey to that of a peasant. One should act with confidence, assured that one is doing something sensible, like a peasant plowing the field or our friend raking the ground. If one has no horse, one should be one's own. Van Gogh knew that becoming a great artist was not an easy process. It required patience. This was the reason why he was so affected by the struggles of working people, because the dedication and perseverance these people showed in their work were qualities Van Gogh sought in himself. The fact that my drawings haven't yet turned out the way I want them to is a constant source of disappointment for me. The challenges are truly varied and significant, and not something that can be overcome in an instant. Progress is like a miner's job. It doesn't progress at the expected or desired speed, but when facing such a challenge, the basic requirements are patience and dedication. Actually, I don't think much about the difficulties, because if one thinks about them too much, one either becomes disoriented or uncomfortable. The perseverance and determination in actions like plowing, sowing seeds, and harvesting fascinated Van Gogh. In fact, Van Gogh became so engrossed in this peasant life that he even aimed to become a peasant painter to better understand it. He began to live like them, going to the fields with the peasants, enduring harsh weather conditions just like them, and observing their struggles firsthand. You can find everything imaginable about peasant life, peasant women, men, housework, childcare, sewing, farm work. Van Gogh loved this peasant painting so much that he even invited Theo to pastoral life. Theo, become a painter, try to save yourself and come resiliently. In other words, son, come and paint with me in the heath, in the potato field. Come walk behind the plow and the shepherd with me. Come sit and watch the fire with me. Let the storm rage inside you too in the heath. Van Gogh wrote his letters in sincere and impressive language. They're very enjoyable to read, with a flowing style. If he had not been a painter, he could easily have been a writer. In one letter, Theo asked Van Gogh to reduce the dark tones in his works and use more vibrant colors instead. Looking at Van Gogh's paintings from that time, the audience sees a much darker and gloomier atmosphere compared to his later works. Eventually, Van Gogh heeded his brother's advice and began making more colorful, vibrant paintings, opening a new chapter in his career with this reform in his art. As Van Gogh started using more vibrant colors, he especially loved one color, yellow. We see these yellow tones in many works. Even the human skin in his self-portraits is unnaturally yellow. More specifically, he loved the yellow-blue contrast and often used them together. As stated previously, Van Gogh loved both yellow and portraying rural life. So, what place perfectly met both criteria for such an artist? Van Gogh painted wheat fields almost throughout his career. He loved nature, and he wanted to capture the connection between plants in nature and human life. When thinking about all the things we don't know the reason for, what else can one do? But go look at a wheat field. Their history is like ours, because we who live on bread are we not largely like wheat? And like them? When we mature, won't we be harvested? Wheat grows first, matures, then is reaped at harvest time, a life cycle like all living things. This cycle restarts with sowing seeds. In this series, the observer also sees Van Gogh's impasto technique, thick, prominent brush strokes. For example, in Wheatfield with Crows, we see thick strokes. Another example of his yellow passion is the sunflowers he painted. Though he painted not only sunflowers but also roses, lilacs, irises, and other flowers. When paid attention to these flowers, the first concept is beauty. Almost all have unique aesthetics. But this beauty doesn't last forever. In Van Gogh's works, though flowers are vivid, details show wilting too. Viewers see beauty and vitality but also become aware of death. Like with wheat, there's a life cycle in flowers. Death does not mean the end. Even when a flower is withered, its seeds can create new ones. Van Gogh especially loved to paint sunflowers, and even his friend Paul Gauguin, who was also a painter, used them. Van Gogh was depicted drawing sunflowers. The dominant color in these works, yellow, has something special quality. Yellow is an energizing color, the color of the sun, close to the joy of life. But red, unlike yellow, isn't considered such a cheerful color. For example, the color red can bring with it danger and a sense of threat. If anxiety had a color, it would probably be red. Moreover, this red color, which Van Gogh used, especially in one of his works, managed to create a tense atmosphere. One of the ugliest paintings I've made. He actually went to a real cafe and painted it like that. In another letter, he gave this information about the cafe he depicted. These places called Café de Nuit are common here. They stay open all night. Night prowlers can shelter when they have no money for lodging or are too drunk to be admitted elsewhere. There's no guarantee that every night cafe will be a decent place. It could become a hangout for the homeless, drunks, and destitute. When you gather people who have nothing to lose in one place, all sorts of dangers can be expected. I tried to express in the night cafe how a cafe can ruin, madden a person, even drive them to crime. Van Gogh deliberately wanted to create an unsettling feeling in this work, and the color red helped with this feeling. Not only red, but the crude contrast created by red and green also adds tension. Even the figure looking at the spectator with red background has green hair and mustache, an oddly ugly pair. The perspective is strange, like in a distorted space defying physics. Interestingly, there is an opposite of this painting, at least from the feelings it is giving, and that painting's name also has the name Café. Instead of the red and green, we are now welcomed by the yellow and blue, way positive than Night Café. Returning to Van Gogh's personal life, Van Gogh befriended Paul Gauguin, who was also a painter. But their relationship was strange. Gauguin was a more experienced painter than Van Gogh. Van Gogh wanted to both learn something about art from Gauguin, and because he did not have many friends, he valued having Gauguin by his side. But there was an issue. Neither of them were normal types. They were impulsive characters. Van Gogh suffered from mental illness, was an alcoholic, and experienced occasional crises, while Gauguin was arrogant and condescending. Van Gogh was generally bothered by Gauguin's attitude, but at the same time, he did not want to leave Gauguin. It should be noted that the two often argued. However, one of these arguments was the precursor to that famous act. During an argument with Gauguin, Van Gogh lost control to such an extent that in a fit of rage, he cut off his own ear with a razor. Later taken to hospital, according to the doctor's report, he had completely severed his left ear. Strangely, Van Gogh later painted a portrait of the doctor. In this painting, there is an absurd detail. For some unknown reason, Vincent decided to depict the doctor's ear as red. Not only did he depict the doctor, but he also painted himself with a severed and bandaged ear, although he has painted himself countless other times. This self-portrait stands out from the others. When paid attention to his eyes, they seem more slanted than his actual eyes, as if he is trying to imitate a Japanese. Vincent mentions this in one of his letters to Theo. I made the eyes but slanted like the Japanese. In his bandaged portrait, one may again see Japanese art in the background, as Van Gogh was a big fan of Japanese art. In the early 19th century, Western artists knew little until 1860s trade introduced it. They loved the exotic colors, style, perspective. Two features in East Asian art influenced Van Gogh: creative color, use, and emphasis on nature. Van Gogh's art already carried a sensitivity for both. In addition, a strange atmosphere of joy prevailed in Japanese art. It has its own sweet side. Vincent made a copy of some. One of these figures on the cover of a Japanese art magazine. He also copied Hiroshigen's paintings. Even in the bedroom in Ala's painting, there is the influence of Japanese art. He also mentions in a letter that for this work, he did not use any shadows as in Japanese works and preferred a flattened perspective. So even in a work where we can't see the Japanese influence at first glance, there is an underlying influence of Japanese art. His own statement summarizes this situation. All my work is based to some extent on Japanese art. One of the things warmed Van Gogh up to Japanese art was that use of exotic colors. Van Gogh loved colors as much as he loved playing with them. Look at the works of Van Gogh painted himself and others. The colors really don't look very natural. In fact, in one of the letters he wrote to his brother, he talks about how he manipulated colors while painting.
I want to paint a dreaming poet friend. I'll arbitrarily use colors. Exaggerate blonde hair to orange, chrome, pale lemon. Behind head, instead of plain wall, richest blue background. The blonde head against blue will mysteriously shine like a star in deep azure.
Van Gogh was an artist who loved playing with colors. He was familiar with color theory, and he frequently used complementary colors, especially red, green, blue, orange, yellow, and purple. He was aware that the contrast they created also made each other more prominent. Similarities can be detected in Impression, Sunrise, by Claude Monet. In fact, one way to make the orange color more prominent is to use blue tones in the background. Van Gogh used this contrast style in many of his works, from portraits to landscape paintings. These color choices played a role in the vibrant, distinct, and dynamic structure of his works. Returning to the infamous ear-cutting incident, after this event, Van Gogh's life was never the same. As a result of continuing crises, Van Gogh was finally admitted to a mental hospital. Normally, if we think about the idea of a mental hospital in the 19th century, for some reason the concept of terrifying and scandalous mental hospitals usually comes mind, like horror movies or games. The fact that this concept was well marketed probably also contributed to our predisposition to it. However, the Street Rummy Mental Hospital where Van Gogh stayed was a quiet, peaceful, and modern place surrounded by nature. The authorities even allowed Van Gogh to paint and gave him a room to use it as a studio. It should be emphasized that Van Gogh showed tremendous productivity during his stay here. He nearly produced 150 works in this hospital, where he stayed about a year. The works that emerged while Van Gogh was in this mental hospital looking out of the windows with beautiful views were also special, of course. Van Gogh created one of the most famous works, Starry Night, while he was in the mental hospital. Actually, this painting is a view from a window in the room where he stayed in the hospital. But interestingly, we also see a village that does not exist. Here, it may be necessary to mention Van Gogh's relation with Gauguin again, because Van Gogh generally painted by looking at the landscape. However, Gauguin encouraged Vincent to paint more with his imagination without looking at the landscape. Perhaps he followed Gauguin's advice in this work, adding a village to the landscape he saw. But the most striking aspect of the work is the depiction of the sky, moon, and the stars are so large, and the spirals. Especially when comparing this work to another Starry Night he made earlier, we can see that he followed a different method in depicting the sky. Regarding this work, he says, "This morning, long before sunrise, I saw the countryside from my window, nothing but the morning star, which looked very large." The star he refers to is located to the right of the tree, and of course it's the largest star in the work. So how large was this large star that Van Gogh mentioned in reality? Let's ask this question in another way. Was what Van Gogh saw as so large really a star? Researchers have noted that in the spring of 1889, when this painting was made, the planet Venus appeared brighter than normal, even bright enough to be seen with the naked eye. Therefore, Van Gogh probably mistook Venus, which appears extremely bright in the sky, due to its reflective atmosphere for a star, and painted it that way. The term morning star is generally used for Venus. Besides the stars, the spirals also catch our attention. The painting seems to have a movement, an animation effect. Perhaps, due to the influence of the spirals, the Starry Night is one of Van Gogh's most frequently animated works. Even after leaving the mental hospital, Van Gogh's life hadn't settled down. He worked so hard, but neglected himself. In his letters, he indicated his deteriorating condition. "My life is attacked at the root, my steps falter." At 37, Vincent shot himself with a gun. All that remained of him were these unique works, created during a career that lasted perhaps 10 years, and letters he wrote. In one letter he says about himself, "In most people's eyes, what am I? A nobody? Odd or unpleasant, with no position in society, and never will, the lowest of the low. Even if, true, one day with my works I'll show what's in this odd one's heart." That's my ambition based on love, despite resentment, serenity over passion. Despite frequent misery, there's still calm, pure harmony, music inside. In poorest huts, dirtiest corners, I see paintings or drawings, and my mind irresistibly turns to them. Throughout the video, I have mentioned the name of another person quite often alongside Vincent, Vincent's brother, Theo. The fact that we have access to so much information about Vincent's personal life, ideas, and art is largely due to his brother Theo. Vincent didn't have the habit of keeping the letters he received from his brother, but Theo carefully preserved them. And these letters, which Theo kept, form the backbone of all the content produced about Van Gogh, including this video. If it weren't for those letters, we would have access to very limited information about Vincent. However, we all owe a debt of gratitude to Theo for benefiting from this information. Shortly after Vincent's death, Theo also passed from an illness. Van Gogh's works were made accessible to the public by Theo's wife, but he didn't live long enough to see it. And this task was left to Joe. Many organizations held exhibitions in Van Gogh's name, and she presented the letters that Theo had kept to the public. She deserves a thanks for dedicating her life to making Van Gogh known. Now, let us return to Vincent. There is a concept called the artist who was tortured, and this concept even brings claims with it. A real artist suffers, and even produces art by distilling that suffering. Usually artists like Dostoevsky and Van Gogh are given as an example for this concept, but the situation with Van Gogh was not quite like that. Yes, he had a mental illness, but this mental illness and the suffering he endured didn't help his art at all. On the contrary, it prevented him from creating art. For example, during his time in a mental hospital, he experienced crises that prevented him from painting several months. When he recovered from these crises, his productivity would increase even more. Madness did not help Van Gogh's art. To think that way would be a great injustice and disrespected to his work, because being very hardworking and equally determined helped him. As you may recall from the beginning of the video, he likened his artistic journey to the work of a laborer, farmer, or miner, seeing it as a process requiring patience and perseverance in a subtle way. Rather than his mental illness helping his art, Vincent was fighting his mental illness through his art. It's not that his mental illness nourished his art, but rather that he overcame this mental illness with his art. There is a message to be taken from this whole process. It is the healing aspect of art. Because despite all these difficulties, engaging in art was good for Van Gogh, as it is for everyone.